Welcome to day two of the 16th annual GIS Day at the College of Staten Island. My name is Nora Santiago. I'm an urban policy analyst, GIS specialist here at CSI. It is my honor to host this year's GIS Day virtually. I hope many of you enjoyed yesterday's presentations. As I mentioned yesterday, this year's GIS Day is very special to me because we brought two topics together that are very dear to me, sustainability and GIS. At today's presentation, we welcome faculty and students from Lehman College's graduate program in Geographic Information Science, focusing on racial and socio-economic disparities when it comes to climate change gentrification. Before we continue with our program, there are some housekeeping rules that I would like to go over. Everyone will be muted during the event, except the speakers. After the presentations, we will have a chance to ask questions. We will try to answer as many questions as we can. Please send your question to Jin Wen, the moderating for event, in the chat throughout the presentations. As I mentioned, today's event will be moderated by Jin Wen. I'm so pleased to announce her as our first speaker today. Jin Wen is an urban planner, data transponder, and the advocate for vocational training and public education. She's a founding director of the Multimedia and Geospatial Information Service Unit at the New York City Economic Development Corporation. She considers herself a data chef, sourcing data from local, state, and federal agencies and offering insight for stakeholders. Her team supports graffiti-free New York City, food retail expansion to support health, and Industrial Development Agency, just to name a few. Jim served on the Community Education Council in Brooklyn's District 15 for one term. She continues to support the current council. She is also honored to participate on the advisory board for Lehman College's MC GIS Science Program, BMCC, and High School of Art and Design. Jin is also the president of Gizmo. I just found out today. So please welcome Jin Ben.
Thank you, everybody, and welcome to today's 2021 celebration of GIS Day. And thank you, Nora, for those very kind words. I just want to say a couple of words before we get to the panel. As the new president of Gizmo, I want to welcome all the audience members to join Gizmo, and you can check us out at gismonyc.org. And our intention and future of in 2022 will be in three folds. One is to reach out to all the local, regional, and even the federal government to see what's happening in the GIS world. The second pillar will be really looking at all the latest in technology in GIS and present it and share it amongst the members. And the third, and I think the most important of all, is networking and really shepherding and mentoring students, our future in GIS for network and getting to know all the, whether it's private or the public sector. Again, it's gismonyc.org. A little bit more about today's, why today's panel is so near and dear to me. Not only was Juliana one of my advisor when I was in Hunter for an urban planning, but the topic is so timely. So I'm gonna save my chat and really turn it over to them by saying a little bit more about this talk. So this panel is from the Urban GIS Science Lab at Lehman College, consists of presentations of 3 related case studies on current gentrification issues in New York City, highlighting the connections between gentrification risk and social justice. The case studies, which represent ongoing research, focus on 1, community urban greening initiatives and the unintended gentrification consequences of this greening. 2, an examination of the socio-demographic built environment, community resiliency, and physical factors that potentially put a community at risk of gentrification. And 3rd, the link between gentrification and green infrastructure implementation and policy. So first we will turn to The first presentation is from Dr. Juliana Mante, and is a professor of urban environmental geography at Lehman College and the CUNY Graduate Center, City University of New York since 1998. She founded and directs the graduate program in Geographic Information Science, as well as the Urban GIS Science Lab, Science Lab, and has created and taught courses such as environmental modeling, spatial analysis of urban health, historical and cultural GIS science, and GIS research methods. Her main research focus are environmental justice, health disparities, risk and exposure assessment, and participatory GIS science, specifically in urban areas, and has edited several compendia and written 2 widely used textbooks and numerous other publications on the urban environment and geospatial analysis. For 25 years prior to her academic career, she was an architect, urban planner, and environmental analyst. Dr. Mante holds degrees from Cornell University, New York University, Hunter College, CUNY, and Rutgers University, and is a member of Gizmo's executive board. Please welcome Dr. Julia Mante.
Hi, greetings everyone. I'm going to share my screen and get my presentation up. Okay. All right, hopefully everyone can see that now. Good. So welcome, greetings, good evening. I'm going to be talking about green gentrification in general at first, and then using a case study of community gardens in Brooklyn to kind of explain some of the concepts in more detail. So when we got started on this, we first asked some questions, right? We were interested in what is the relationship between urban greening and green gentrification? What are the implications of green gentrification for environmental justice? And when we think about sustainable and beautiful green cities, who benefits? Because everyone doesn't benefit equally. So I think everyone pretty much can agree that urban greening and sustainability approaches, to improve the urban environment and combat the climate crisis, those are good things, right? However, these greening efforts may have unintended consequences, which result in adverse impacts to the existing residents, who are often the most vulnerable of the urban populations. So I'm going to cut to the chase and tell you what our ultimate goal is. So the goal should be for the regeneration of neighborhoods through revitalization, rehabilitation, and or replacement of aspects of the physical environment that are not working well, but without the replacement of the people who live there. So in other words, let's improve things and improve them for the people that are there now, instead of just making it better for the affluent people that will move in and displace the people there. So I'm just going to go through very quickly a few of the terms that are important to understand in this work. Gentrification, all that means is it's a significant change in the area's socio-economic characteristics, physical environment, overall neighborhood culture and economics, or any combination of the above, and it's usually more than one, that tends to lead to the displacement of existing neighborhood residents and businesses, and their replacement by more affluent residents and upscale businesses. So in most cases in the US, the existing people, the displaced residents, are generally people of color, immigrants, ethnic minorities, or lower income and working class whites, and the residents who replace them are usually more affluent and non-Hispanic white. Environmental justice, the major aim of that is to ensure that everybody, and I mean everybody, has good environmental quality and access to environmental goods. Now, over the past 30 or more years, we've done research, and we have all this evidence that poor people, people of color, and other vulnerable groups are more likely to live near noxious facilities, polluting facilities, and burdensome land uses than more affluent and white populations. That's pretty much been proven without a doubt. And in addition to this, the people that are exposed to these environmental burdens also tend to have worse access to health promoting activities, and such as parks, healthy food, and restorative open spaces. So what is urban greening? It's really been looked at recently as a solution for improving poor environmental quality in our cities, as well as mitigating the adverse impacts of climate change. So that's all to the good. These things could include cleanup of contaminated lands and turning it into some kind of constructive use, the so-called brownfields to greenfields, and a lot of community gardens fall into this category. Also, installation of green infrastructure, things like bioswales, vegetated roofs, blue belt stormwater management systems like we have in Staten Island, rain gardens, green streets, and you'll be hearing more about this from Rose Jimenez, who's speaking later in the evening. It also could include transformation of abandoned or underutilized things like unused commercial waterfront areas, transportation rights of way. And we see those things in, for instance, like the Highline Park in Manhattan, which is one of New York's most popular parks right now. So the question, as we mentioned, is who benefits from these urban greening projects? How can we make sure the benefit is equitably distributed? And how can we ensure that existing populations are not penalized when urban greening improves neighborhood? I mean, we want to improve the neighborhoods, but not at the expense of the people who live there. So previous research has found that physical and even visual access to green space is beneficial both for physical and mental health. But unfortunately, access to urban green space is not equally distributed amongst all subpopulations, and this disproportionately impacts minorities and other vulnerable populations. Even in cases where physical access is available, the quality of the green space is often subpar. And there's also in poor and minority neighborhoods a disproportionate amount of vacant and derelict land as a result of deindustrialization, landlord abandonment, and general disinvestment in these areas. So the poorer neighborhoods, the less affluent neighborhoods tend to have a lot of vacant and derelict land. It's often very contaminated or otherwise hazardous to health and quality of life. And we found in a study that even just the visual blight aspect of living with derelict land can have mental health implications. Now, many communities have proactively transformed some of this vacant land into beneficial spaces for the community, such as community gardens. And here's an example of one in Williamsburg. And here are some more photos of community gardens. So community gardens are great. It allows people to grow food. The food can benefit their own families as well as families in the neighborhood that have food insecurity. They can be centers of artistic efforts. People make murals or mosaics or sculptures. They can also often have little structures, little casitas or little kiosks where people do cultural events or music performances. And they can serve as a real oasis in neighborhoods that don't really have access to a lot of green. They also sometimes do educational things, environmental educational things for kids or young people. And in general, they're, very beneficial. So I already went through a lot of these, but I'll just point out that it's also a means of political and social empowerment and promotes a sense of place in the community. It can become a focal point in communities. So with all those good things that community gardens can perform, what's the problem? So the problem is, it's been shown that beautification of neighborhoods through things like community gardens can tend to increase property values. It can even increase rents. And then developers notice this and they say, well, you know, this might be a very good neighborhood to invest in. But they're not going to invest in the neighborhood to help the people that are already there. They're going to invest in the neighborhood to make a profit. And that will come in the form usually of market rate housing. So what happens in this case is that the people in the neighborhood, the people in the community that work hard to make these community gardens, then they feel as if their hard work has sown the seeds of their own destruction. So now segueing to the Brooklyn Community Gardens case study, this is our main research question. Is proximity to community gardens in less affluent neighborhoods associated with an increased likelihood of gentrification? So I'm going to talk a little bit about the methods we used, but I'll tell you right up front, the results of the analysis are that proximity to community gardens is associated with a significant increase in per capita income over the 5-year study period, which is indicative of areas undergoing gentrification. So this has implications for environmental justice because existing lower income residents are likely to be displaced after their community is improved environmentally. And people are then often pushed out into other parts of the city that may be even more overcrowded or environmentally damaged or unhealthy. And we're not really saying that community gardens in and of themselves cause gentrification, but they can be a contributing factor. So this is just a photo showing some folks making raised beds to grow vegetables so they don't have to use the contaminated soil of the lot. Okay, so here's our study area, Brooklyn. Brooklyn has 2.6 million residents, so it's a very populous borough. 36% approximately are non-Hispanic white, 33% non-Hispanic Black, 20% Hispanics of any race, and 11% other races or multi-race people. So you can see it's a very, very diverse neighborhood, very, very diverse borough. However, you can also see from the map on the right that it's fairly segregated. So each dot, it's a dot density map, each dot represents 200 people. The red are non-Hispanic white, the blue are non-Hispanic Black, and the yellow are Hispanic or Latino people. So it is still quite segregated. So as our metric to see about gentrification encroachment, we used 2010 per capita income adjusted to $2015. So at that time, the Brooklyn-wide value for per capita income was $25,000 and change per year. And the map on the left represents the divergence from that Brooklyn-wide value. So the deeper the purple, the further below the Brooklyn-wide value it is, and the deeper the green, the higher above the Brooklyn-wide value, okay? So we're looking to really focus on the low-income block groups, census block groups. So the map on the right is just showing the binary, the gray ones are lower income, they're below the Bronx-wide per capita income. The black ones are above the per capita income. And overlaid on this is the location of the community gardens. Each dot represents a community garden. And you can see that most of them are in the lower income block groups. And we thought it would be instructive to separate out, depending on when the gardens were founded, like this may have some influence on gentrification if older gardens or newer gardens might have some effect. So the green dots are the gardens that were founded before 2005, and some of these go back to the 1960s and 70s. And then the orange dots, there are only a few of those, are from 2005 to 2009, and the red dots are from 2010 and forward. So the lower income blocks, obviously we're more interested in them because they're at a higher risk of gentrification. So we did a couple different spatial analyses. The first one was looking at catchment areas for each community garden. So we located the community garden, and then we used network analysis to look at quarter-mile walking distance, figuring that's about all the people that are going to be impacted or influenced by that community garden. And then we looked at how many community gardens are within walking distance of each block group, of each census block group. So the maps show the lighter color green is more gardens. So these are kind of concentrations, right? So the lighter green is showing the block group is near anywhere between 11 and 22 gardens, if you can imagine, within a quarter of a mile. So it's very, very high concentration of community gardens. We separated out into looking at all the gardens, regardless of when they were founded. And then the bottom two maps are the more recent gardens. And we did a hotspot analysis using GEDIS or GIS star statistic. And this is showing the same kind of information in a little different analytical way. All the gardens, regardless of when founded, and then the more recent gardens down below. So when we looked at this in terms of change in per capita income, right, we're just looking at change from 2010 to 2015. And if you live in a block group where there's no community garden within a quarter of a mile, the change in per capita income between those 2 years was about $1,214, which is similar to the Brooklyn-wide change. But if you live near one or more community gardens, the change in per capita income was almost double. It was $2,350. When we look at the more recent gardens, there's still a change, but it is not as great. But it's a pretty significant change for looking at all the gardens together. And this is just a bar graph of the same information. So if you live near no community gardens versus one or more, you can see the change in per capita income is considerably higher. It's higher for the more recent gardens as well, but not as much. So the block group level t-test suggests that proximity to one or more community gardens is associated with significant increases in per capita income in lower income census block groups between 2010 and 2015. The association is weaker when you're looking only at the more recent gardens. We don't really know why this is, but we speculate that it could be because recently founded community gardens have not been in existence long enough, perhaps, to attract gentrification to their neighborhoods, or it may reflect some difference in community activism and resistance to gentrification amongst the areas with the more recent community gardens. Now, I'm not going to have time to go through all this, but there's a lot of sort of contextual considerations and caveats with any of this work. So the gentrification frontier can vary significantly from place to place. There may be a block by block microgeography in play, resulting in more fragmented or discontinuous gentrification frontier. Highly segregated neighborhoods versus ethnically diverse areas also influence the paths that gentrification takes. And the existence of many community gardens within lower income neighborhoods may reflect or even hopefully produce the relative higher social cohesion in these areas, and as such may help a community to resist gentrification. Now, there are some recommendations, and there are some things for sure that communities can do on their own to resist gentrification or to at least delay it. But for the most part, it's government that has to step up to the plate, implementing policies that can help stabilize communities and prevent rapid gentrification. And they can do this through affordability protections, anti-gentrification rental controls, different things they can do with zoning ordinances to prevent inappropriate contextual development, rehabilitating existing housing stock and giving homeowners and landlords financial incentives, mixed-use zoning, smaller developments at scattered sites rather than large mega projects, housing geared more to families than studios and one bedrooms, and limited equity, I should say, cooperative housing. And above all, incorporating nature more seriously into all urban planning, all parts of the city, and not just as an afterthought or as a part of a profit-making scheme. So final thoughts. We shouldn't be building sustainable neighborhoods only for the higher income section of the population, either passively or actively through the displacement of lower income families. Sustainable development, if it's actually to be sustainable, should not be for some, but for all. Some references, people that might be interested in looking into this further. And I have put up here a couple of publications that came out of this research. The first one talks not only about the Brooklyn Community Garden study, but also a study that we did on the Highline Park in Manhattan and some urban park initiatives in Barcelona, Spain. Here's my contact information, my email, some websites for the Masters of Science in GIS program and the Urban GIS Lab website as well. I welcome anybody that's interested to get in touch with me. I'd be happy to talk to you about any of this stuff. And that is it.
Thank you, Juliana. We already have some questions, but we'll hold that till the end. So next up, give me 1 second. Okay. Next up, Yanitya Piedra, are you ready? Here's a little bit about Yanitya. Yanitya is an aspiring GIS professional, research assistant at the CUNY Institute of Health Equity, as well as the Urban GIS Science Lab, and an adjunct instructor of GIS at LaGuardia Community College. She graduated from the State University of New York College at Geneseo and a Bachelor of Art degree in Geography and minors in Environmental Studies and Anthropology. After her undergraduate studies, Yanitya worked as a GIS technician in California, but later returned to New York in pursuit of higher education. Currently a full-time master's student at Lehman College, she's expected to graduate in January of 2022 with a Master of Science degree in Geographic Information Science. Post-graduation, Yanitya hopes to pursue a career in GIS that aligns with her interest in environmental issues, social justice, wildlife conservation, and applications of GIS and GIS technology. Yanitya, are you ready?
Yes, I'm ready.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Jen, for the introduction. Following the keynote today's presentation, I'll be talking about an ongoing project that I have been working on in collaboration with the Bronx Council for the Arts, developing a gentrification risk probability index for the Bronx using data from 2010 to 2019. The Bronx is perhaps the last New York City borough to face threats of gentrification, which is often results in longtime residents and businesses being displaced. The Bronx has the lowest per capita and household income in New York City, while Manhattan has the highest per capita income in the entirety of New York State. Of the 62 New York State counties, Bronx County ranks last in 3 metrics of prosperity, including per capita income, median household income, and median family income, according to the 2015-2019 American Community Survey 5-year estimates. With a mere $21,778 per capita income, the Bronx suffers from severe income inequality, a harsh reality considering its neighboring borough Manhattan has a per capita income of $76,593, roughly a $55,000 difference, and it doesn't stop there. Not only is the Bronx the lowest earning borough, it is also the poorest urban county in the nation, and parts of the Bronx are within the poorest congressional district in the nation as well. The severe inequality between the Bronx and its surrounding areas extends well beyond income statistics in the Bronx, as the Bronx also experiences severe health inequalities and disproportionate environmental burdens. Before we get into the details of the index factors and results, I'd like to show a snapshot of the Bronx mean household income by census tract in 2019. As we can see here, the majority of Bronx households make less than the average person in Manhattan. The lower mean household incomes are concentrated in the southwest quarter of the Bronx, while the highest household incomes can be observed in Riverdale. When looking at the corresponding race and ethnicities in those areas, we can see that the majority of the Southwest Bronx, which is where we observed lower mean household income, is comprised of Hispanics or Latinos, and the higher mean household income areas, such as that of Riverdale, are mostly comprised of non-Hispanic white people. Now that we have an idea of what the Bronx looks like in terms of income and racial demographics, we can begin to discuss the index. Indices are mainly developed to model existing conditions, though they can also be used for predictive purposes. Attaching index scores to components of geographic areas allows us to rank and assess things like vulnerability, risk, and suitability. This analysis aims to identify areas of the Bronx that may be at risk or vulnerable to gentrification based on factors used in published literature on gentrification studies across the United States. We looked at 23 papers on gentrification studies and modeled our index based on a selection of components from the Freeman method and Shorkey's 2001 Neighborhood Vulnerability to Gentrification Index, among others. To clarify, this study is not designed to be a predictive index showing where gentrification will occur, and it's not meant to identify specifically where gentrification has already taken place, and it's not meant to link prior gentrification with other factors, such as the present or absence of some environmental condition or specific population. The Gentrification Risk Probability Index was designed merely to suggest where there may be a greater likelihood of gentrification based on factors known to be related to the gentrification process, according to our extensive literature review. Based on our literature review of the existing research and seeing what seemed to work best and adapting it to the Bronx, we decided to create a simplified, unweighted, ranked gentrification probability index based on characteristics or factors deemed to be encouraging or deterring of gentrification at the census tract level. Since we had no conclusive evidence of each factor's relative importance, all factors were given a value of either positive or -1. Factors deemed to be encouraging of gentrification were given a score of +1, while factors deemed to be discouraging or deterring of gentrification were given a score of -1. The final gentrification risk probability score was produced by adding up the scores of all factors at each census tract. In an effort to get as much done as possible in a timely manner, all data used in our in-progress index were downloaded from publicly available sources. We did not partake in the time-intensive data collection process, meaning that we did not gather any primary data, we did not send out any surveys, or conduct any interviews. We relied solely on reliable secondary data sources, such as official city or federal data from the US Bureau of the Census and the Environmental Protection Agency. These data sets were generally consistent throughout our study area, the Bronx. They were fully vetted by their originators and are familiar to researchers and analysts alike. When talking about gentrification, we are referring to gentrification that would pose a risk to vulnerable populations. We're not necessarily referring to super gentrification, which occurs when the middle and upper classes are pushed out by the ultra wealthy. With this in mind, we mapped the spatial distribution of 2019 median household income to provide a snapshot of where gentrification is possible. In 2019, the Bronx median household income was $41,470. Census tracts with the median household income below the borough median were considered to be eligible for gentrification, which is what you see in yellow. As we can see on this map, tracts considered eligible for gentrification are concentrated in the West Bronx. This one-off analysis was used to give us an idea of what our final results could possibly look like. In total, we used 10 encouraging factors and 8 discouraging or deterring factors. Encouraging factors included social demographics, such as percent change in mean household income, percent change in non-Hispanic white population, and percent change in educational attainment, all from 2010 to 2019. We also included proximity factors, such as proximity to subway stations, empowerment zones, historic districts, vacant land, parks, community gardens, and cultural facilities such as theaters. For most of the proximity factors, a buffer distance of a quarter mile was used. A quarter mile was used as the zone of impact or influence, as that is the distance considered to be walkable in most urban areas. The Bronx-wide percent change in mean household income from 2010 to 2019 was about 24.1%. Therefore, tracts with a change above 24.1 were given an encouraging factor flag of +1, which is what you see in yellow. The Bronx-wide percent change in non-Hispanic white population from 2010 to 2019 was 15.3. Tracts with a percent change greater than 15.3 were given an encouraging factor flag of +1. Again, in yellow, the Bronx-wide percent change in population 25 years and older with a bachelor's degree or higher from 2010 to 2019 was 2%. Therefore, tracts with a percent change greater than 2% were giving an encouraging factor flag of +1 once more. And then census tracts within a quarter mile distance of a subway station were given an encouraging factor flag of +1 if at least 25% of the tract area was located within that quarter mile buffer, which is the pink buffers that you see around the points. The points are our subway stations. For census tracts within a quarter mile of a community garden, we're given an encouraging factor flag as well, and we use the same 25% area containment method. And then finally, we get to our deterring factors. The 8 discouraging or deterring factors also included proximity factors, such as proximity to potentially burdensome facilities, like detention centers, correctional facilities, and transportation maintenance yards. We also included elevated subway lines, solid waste and wastewater facilities, facilities on the EPA's toxic release inventory list, NYCHA public housing developments, and manufacturing zones. We also included some community resiliency factors, such as the presence of social support services and public access cultural facilities. Potentially burdensome facilities, like I said, include things like transportation maintenance yards. So for this one, we again use the 25% containment method. So census tracts within a quarter mile of a potentially burdensome facility, we're giving a discouraging factor flag if at least 25% of the tract area was located within the quarter mile buffer. The same similar method was used for solid waste and wastewater facilities. So you can see that a lot of them are spread out in the South Bronx. For public housing developments, those are pretty much widespread with the exclusion of this area north of Pelham Parkway and Riverdale. For our manufacturing zones, we did things a little bit differently because manufacturing zones are pretty large, especially in the South Bronx. So for this, census tracts were given a discouraging factor flag if at least 25% of the tract area intersected with the manufacturing zone. With a total of 10 encouraging factors and a total of 8 discouraging or deterring factors, the lowest possible gentrification risk score we could have had at any census tract was a -8, and the highest possible score we could have had was +10. Census tracts with a score at or below 0 were not considered to be at risk according to our index. A score of 1 or higher indicates possible gentrification risk. Of 339 census tracts in the Bronx, 38.94% were considered to be in the safe zone, and the remaining 61.06% of tracts were considered to be at risk, with scores ranging from 1 to 5. And that makes up 207 census tracts that are considered to be at risk or at some level of risk of gentrification, according to our index. In order to further analyze our results, we ran a hotspot analysis to identify statistically significant hotspots and cold spots using the GEDIS or GI star spatial statistic. The results of our in-progress index show that there are 2 larger hotspots, one covering the Bedford Park, Fordham, and Belmont area, and another covering parts of the Concourse and Claremont. There was also one smaller hotspot in Riverdale. Conversely, there were cold spots in the Pelham Garden area north of Pelham Parkway and in parts of Union, Port, Soundview, and Castle Hill. Curious about what things would look like if we ignored census tract boundaries, we then created an interpolated or continuous surface of our results, and the higher and lower scores remained pretty consistent for the most part. We still have our hotspots in these general areas and our cold spots in these general areas. Some of these results may be alarming, particularly in areas where there is a higher risk of gentrification, according to the index as developed thus far. Dr. Mante has already gone through some of the recommendations, but I'd still like to conclude by saying that the adverse impacts of gentrification can be reduced or slowed down. However, that will require policy and regulatory decisions that would need to be implemented and funded by the local government in a socially equitable manner. In order for Bronx community members to take part in the gentrification slowing process, there needs to be a more widespread awareness. The community would need to be fully vested in understanding why those policies would help their neighborhoods, and they would need to partner with local government to get the process started. The next steps in this project would be to look at and implement the 2020 census data. The index as shown today is using the American Community Survey from 2019, which is a 5-year data, which is really from 2005 to 2019, which poses some issues. Using actual census data would be best, as the ACS only surveys a sample of the population, and the census would be including anyone who does complete the census. We'd also like to include additional factors. As more data becomes available, we may consider adding weights to our factors once we can determine relative importance, and would be interested in ground truthing our results. I'd like to end my presentation with some acknowledgements. A big thank you to Viviana and Brian from the Bronx Council of the Arts, who helped to inspire this study, Raquel Caro and Rosa Argueta, who contributed to the earlier components of the study, Caesar, who was able to assist us with his knowledge of publicly available New York City data sets, and Professor Andrew Morocco, who shared his wisdom on cluster and hotspot analysis methods. So thank you for your time and attention. We'll have some time for questions later, but if you have any more detailed questions, you can also email me and I'll put that in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you, Yanitza. That was, we got 2 questions already. So just keep the question coming, but I'm creating a wonderful list. So our next speaker is Rose Jimenez. Rose, are you ready? But first, Rose Jimenez is a geographer and environmental scientist from Brooklyn, New York. Currently, Rose is a PhD candidate in geography in the Earth and Environmental Science program at the University of New York Graduate Center, and pursuing a graduate certificate in Geographic Information Science at Community College in fellowship with the NOAA, and I think it's NOAA, right? EPP Center for Earth System Science and Remote Sensing Technologies. After being introduced to environmental science at Brooklyn Technical High School, Rose received a BA from Stony Brook University and worked in the food industry, academic administration, and municipal government before pursuing graduate environmental health research. Rose believes that environmental justice is key to reducing the socioeconomic gradient of health outcomes. We welcome Rose.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for your time, and thank you so much to the other presenters for your work. My name is Rose Jimenez, and I'm a PhD candidate at the CUNY Graduate Center and the Urban Geographic Information Science Lab at Lehman College. I'm supported by a grant from the NOAA Center for Earth System Science and Remote Sensing Technologies. And today I want to talk a little bit about the preliminary research I did for my dissertation on green gentrification in Brooklyn, New York. My objective in this phase of the project is to look at socio-demographic risk measurements during phases of green infrastructure development. Because there's a constant flux of intentional, unintentional, official and unofficial changes in land use and land cover, such as people making their own gardens or green roofs, or things getting destroyed, I needed to find a proxy representation of municipally managed green infrastructure. So I decided to use the green infrastructure installation that occurred from the New York City Green Infrastructure Program in 2013 to 2018. To develop a baseline of economic, ecological, and demographic changes that spatially coincide with green infrastructure, I applied risk scores from 5 indexes or indices to Brooklyn to create choropleth or color block maps of risk and overlaid locations of municipal green infrastructure assets to act as a proxy representation for what I'm calling authoritative urban greening practices. So things that are managed or owned from the city. My research question for this phase of the overall project is, how does the landscape of city-sponsored green infrastructure in Brooklyn spatially coincide with socioeconomic risk hotspots? Introduced in 2010, the New York City Green Infrastructure Program was introduced after an order on consent to reduce sewage discharges into open water and help New York City comply with the Clean Water Act. So basically, as you can see in the animation on top, during times where there's a lot of water entering the sewer, such as rain or heavy domestic use, the sewer system can get overloaded and has to be relieved via these combined sewer outfalls or CSOs in order to prevent damage to the sewer or overloads at the sewage treatment facilities. This overflow contains raw sewage and other pretty nasty stuff, and it's really not great for our water systems. Different types of green infrastructure, like in the slideshow on the bottom, are used to capture storm flow on the streets to both minimize how much water enters the sewer and how frequently water overflows into open water bodies. So what exactly is green infrastructure? There's a lot of things, there's a lot of ways to describe it, but the definition I like to use is this one from AmericanRivers.org, which is an approach to water management that protects, restores, or mimics the natural water cycle. Part of the reason I like this definition is that it supports this idea that beyond the primary purpose of stormwater management, urban greening kind of recreates or reintroduces a lot of the greening that was lost during the process of industrialization and development. And in the social aspect, creates recreation, leisure, and neighborhood attractiveness, and like people's relationship with nature that are not typical in a traditional urban landscape. So these co-benefits have been theorized to boost political salience and financial feasibility and exempt them from the discourse around sustainable growth, negative discourse, that is. There are many types of green infrastructure across Brooklyn. Most recognizably, there are green and blue roofs and rooftop farms, but there are also bioswales, which make up the majority of green infrastructure that utilize tree beds to capture storm flow. There's permeable pavement, broken stone, and subsurface storage units that hold large volumes of water underground. This is the general distribution of green infrastructure by type, but for simplicity's sake, in the upcoming maps that I'm going to show, I have them all symbolized the same way, just by location. So it's sort of like a dot density map. The 5 indexes that I use to explore gentrification risk and other socio-ecological risks are the Gentrification Pressure Index from NOAA, the New York City Heat Vulnerability Index, the Small Area Index of Gentrification, typologies of gentrification and displacement, and the housing risk chart. I'm also working on a modified Gini index of inequality for Brooklyn that's not in this presentation. It will be in my dissertation, but I don't think we're going to be able to get to that today. So what I'm going to do now is go through 5 maps of these indexes that have been applied to Brooklyn with green infrastructure overlaid on top. Because each index takes different demographic and economic factors into account, the highest risk based on the research goals logically falls in a slightly different place on each map. First, just as a baseline, this is the NOAA Gentrification Pressure Index, NOAA defines gentrification as concurrent demographic shifts and economic transformations. And while this is county level and it's not very useful overall, and it doesn't give us much nuance, the gentrification pressure index measures retiree migration, urban sprawl, and housing disruption as primary indicators of social vulnerability against gentrification in coastal economies, which New York City very much is. It's slightly different than other coastal communities in that it doesn't really have much retiree migration or retiree in migration. And over the time period of the study, Kings County score changed from 8 out of 12 to 9 out of 12, which isn't that much, but it did bring it up to the highest risk category that NOAA utilizes in managing its coastal regions in its jurisdiction. While the heat vulnerability index is not a gentrification index, it does have the social, economic, and demographic factors that fall under what NOAA defines as gentrification, which I thought was very interesting. The HVI marks areas in risk categories of 1 to 5 of vulnerability to heat-related illness or death. The environmental factors it takes into consideration are green space and surface temperatures, and the social factors it takes into consideration are air conditioner presence, poverty, and race. The highest risk for heat vulnerability is in these Northeast areas, so East New York, and the areas west of East New York. The small area index of gentrification takes an approach that uses changes in median rent, changes in non-Hispanic white populations, percent of young workforce adults, as I'm calling them, and percentage of college educated adults. This falls in line with their loose definition of gentrification to be an economic strategy for cities to reinvigorate local economies in a way that drives up property values to an extent that threatens to displace low-income residents and communities of color. Development initiatives are, in their perspective, geared toward tourists, visitors, and highly educated professionals who are poised to have high salaries. The small area index of gentrification applied to Brooklyn results in the highest gentrification risk being in North Brooklyn from 2000 to 2016. And because it has a little bit of a different time period, this is 10 years versus 18 years, that might also account for some of the differences in levels. Comparatively, the housing risk chart for 2020, as we can see here, focuses more on just the last 1 year. Applied to Brooklyn, the highest risk of gentrification is also found in the East New York area, but it's more concentrated in those neighborhoods and on the border of Queens. The housing risk chart includes an initiative to take a lot of real and unexpected circumstances that we've been facing over the last 2 years, including coronavirus disease, death, and case rates. A lot of us have, especially in New York City, in the very early stages of the pandemic, lost people to COVID and to other things, which they're calling excess deaths of COVID. And these have led to an increase in rent burden because of loss of income from deceased or ill family members of the household, an increase in disability prominence from coronavirus disease, and medical bills and other lost wages from layoffs, and et cetera, other losses of income. The urban displacement project's urban displacement chart focuses more on typologies of gentrification rather than just scores or a gradient of gentrification types. Some factors they include in the risk analysis per census tract are population size, income level at the beginning and end of the time period, which is also 2000 to 2016. diminishment of low-income housing and low-income migration rate. It displays the highest level of exclusion in Northwest Brooklyn, especially the Red Hook area, and ongoing displacement of low-income housing down Brooklyn's Central Line. So what we can see is that the goals for each index determine the factors they include, which results in varying hotspots and cold spots for gentrification, gentrification risk, and gentrification pressure, also dependent on their definition. However, all the hotspots on each map have a large number of city-owned green infrastructure units within them, and the cold spots have little to no green infrastructure units from the New York City Green Infrastructure Program within them. One thread that I want to draw throughout my whole dissertation and in this phase of the project is that while purely topological or geological considerations for green infrastructure siting are used, such as bedrock type, you can't really build a bioswale if the bedrock is too hard, for example. They still have exclusionary impacts that recreate these risky social landscapes or risky economic landscapes. When reading the Comprehensive Waterfront Development Plan, which is also known as Vision 2020, you can see that areas with these particular green infrastructure units have plans for residential and recreational development, such as Reach 14 in the Greenpoint, Williamsburg, Navy Yard area, while areas without this green infrastructure projects within them, like the Bay Ridge Bensonhurst area, are receiving more industrial development like waste transfer stations and big box stores. So there's more industrial usages in these areas. So this is just the first phase of my dissertation research. I think this is the more quantitative part. And I want to analyze these results alongside a few different things. So approved versus rejected grant applications for private property owners to install green roofs on their property, green infrastructure inclusion in citywide long-term planning projects, kinds of resident protections that Juliana listed more extensively in her presentation that have been successful in reducing or eliminating displacement, and health, safety, and sustainable development overall. I think that when we talk about sustainability, we need to really talk about what we're trying to sustain, because what we're sustaining right now is a lot of the inequities that we've been facing for a very long time. And I think things are tending to get worse economically. And there's an increase in economic segregation more than an improvement for everyone overall. I used a lot of data and references from authoritative places. So you can check out these data sources if you want to analyze the same data. It's all publicly available. And I can be reached at this email here that I can put in the chat so everyone can see it. I work with Juliana in the Urban GIS lab, and I hope to defend my dissertation in the spring. Thank you.
Thank you, speakers. Wow. We have some wonderful questions. I have a few myself, but since we have wonderful audience questions already, we'll start there. So first question, set of questions to Juliana in that order. From Katie, do you know the average age of the people moving in? Is this a hipster problem? Juliana?
We didn't analyze age. That is a good thing to do. And I think one of the indices that Rose mentioned did look at that, early career type cohort. But I suspect just anecdotally that age would have a great deal to do with it.
Can I actually make another comment about age, even though it's your question, Juliana?
Sure.
A lot of New York City has so many amazing colleges. And what tends to happen, and this is seen in voter registration research, people move to New York City, they're 17, 18 years old, and they never actually update their residence address, their actual permanent address. So they're not necessarily visible in census data or depending on how they're filling it out. So if you're living in a dorm or you and a bunch of your friends are getting an apartment, once you move in, people don't tend to fill out the census at that point because it's not their quote unquote permanent residence. And so I think there are more 18 to 24-year-olds than are visible in the data significantly. And I think that's why a lot of people wind up not voting, because obviously if your polling place is out of state, it's really hard to get there. And maybe you're 18 and voting for the first time and don't understand all the processes, but I think the age data is very skewed in that way.
I mean, so Rose, do you think that have you thought, just kind of going for one more second on that, your comment? So are there ways? Have you seen any method to correct this? Have you seen anything that might help?
I'm not sure. I think people change their residence mostly for voting, because you don't really have to change your residence unless you have if you're in private school, you don't need the in-state or out-of-state tuition. I really think that getting people to sign up to register to vote might help them actually, excuse the sirens outside, might help them gain residence and make more agency in that area to make the data more complete, I guess.
We have one comment in terms of the age. So Jonathan Peters commented for you, Rose. He said he would encourage you to discuss the issues of age distribution with the Census Bureau staff. Maybe that's the next presentation. Here. Okay, age is always a good one. The fluid population is always an interesting one. But let's go back to another question to, again, Juliana. A thank you for Maria first for your presentation. Is there a relationship between community gardens and the quality of sidewalk? Ooh, another index.
I don't know. I mean, sidewalks are a tricky thing. The sidewalks are owned by the city, but the people who fronts on the sidewalk, it's kind of their responsibility to clear the snow and the leaves and so forth. But if you have something wrong with your sidewalk, never fix it, because then you're liable if somebody hurts themselves. So if the tree is pushing up, their roots and breaking the sidewalk, or you have cracks or something, you can call the city, tell them to come fix it. If they don't fix it, don't fix it, because you're liable then. So I would tend to think that community garden people are smart about this, and they wouldn't have anything to do with sidewalk repair if they're smart, because then they're liable. So I would tend to think there's probably not any kind of, if you're asking, would sidewalks be improved in front of community gardens? I don't know, but I suspect they would be just the same as any other sidewalks.
Great. Another question for Juliana Jayola. I hope I said your name correctly. Can community garden affect the property values with the introduction of rodents? Also, is it more affected in lower income? Hope I read this correctly.
Not really sure what he's getting at, but certainly community gardens do affect the property values, usually by increasing them. because it's seen as a positive in the neighborhood. Now, in terms of rodents, I don't know. That's a good question. I'm not sure if community gardens attract more than any other lot in terms of rodents. I have not done any studies on that.
Hmm.
Maybe somebody from the health department, they have a whole vermin unit. And we actually had a few students that interned there with the rat unit. And there is a lot of, they're doing a lot to combat the rat situation. So they would probably know much more than I about relative conditions between the community gardens and any other lot, whether it's a house or a business. Of course, you know, rats are going to be around places that are restaurants and things like that. But yeah, one of our student interns did a whole, he used to have to go out in the night and count the rats around little parks. I don't know. I know we have somebody on from Department of Health. He's one of our advisory board people, Moose. I don't know if he can talk. Maybe Moose, Mustafa Ali, his name is. If he's still on the call, maybe he wants to talk about the rats.
No. Ishmael, can you unmute him to invite him to speak?
Who is that?
Mustafa Ali.
1 second.
I don't know if he's still on. I saw him on earlier.
Yeah, he is here. Just give me 1 second. Mustafa, are you here?
All right. I don't want to put him on the spot. So
Yeah,
let's
yes, we
move on to
continue.
the next question.
Okay. So the next question is to Yanitzia. First of all, I think there's a congratulations from Maria for your presentation, and she has 2 questions.
Uh-oh.
Where the factors weighted, meaning all factors were predicted to have the same impact? Question number 2, why was vacant lots an encouraging factor?
So the index was not weighted. Everything was given either a value of +1 or -1. So if something was an encouraging factor, it was given a score of +1. And if it was discouraging or deterring, it was given a value of -1. So everything still has a 1. It'll just be positive or negative. And we used vacant lots because that's usually land that's available for development. We could have different types of vacant lots, but generally it means that that's available for new construction. You can demolish what's already there and build something new. So that's why we ended up using those. They are pretty spread out throughout the Bronx, but there's the tracts that ended up being highlighted. So the ones that you did see in yellow are the ones that had an area of vacant lots greater than the average area of vacant lots per census tract in the Bronx. Does that answer your question?
Let me just add to that too for clarification. I mean, everything Yanitza said is correct. Vacant lots is one of those things, in a way, almost like community gardens, where you could say it could go either way, right? It could be encouraging or it could be discouraging. So vacant lots could be discouraging because it does usually imply a certain kind of visual blight to the neighborhood and make it look less attractive, and maybe even pose some danger in terms of contaminated soil or whatnot. But on the other hand, we ended up feeling it was an encouraging factor for the reasons Yanitza said. It's a place for development to occur. And I think if we're going to do maybe a more detailed analysis at some point of this, I think that the whole idea of vacant lots would have to be looked at much more in terms of concentration. And we started getting at that, what Yanitza said, with the methodology of the amount, the proportion of each census tract, how much of it was vacant land. So rather than just counting lot by lot, because some lots are big and some lots are small, just doing it sort of a concentration like that. But that is, it gets very complicated. I mean, all these factors really, you could try to ferret out what the influence is, and it can get very, you have to have some fairly sophisticated methodological approaches. But yeah, some of these factors, you could make a case for either way, deterring or encouraging. But in the end, we felt it was encouraging because, after all, if land is vacant, then it's sort of ripe for development.
Another question from Andrew to Yonitsa. Most of the subway tracks in the Bronx are elevated, causing non-ideal living conditions to those around them, noise pollution, etc. How much impact do you think this will have on gentrification in the Bronx?
So when we did the analysis, we did consider that. So one of the factors was the elevated subway lines. We have subway stops as being encouraging, and then location of the elevated lines being discouraging. So I think it'll only impact the immediate area. So for that specific factor, we didn't have a map of it shown because of the time constraints. But for that, we used a 500-foot buffer. So that'd be about the distance that you would be able to hear the train if you, I don't know how many of you have lived near them, really close to them. I live about a block away from one, and you can hear it from the apartment I used to live in. And I know that the people that lived in nearby buildings, they can almost feel the vibration of them. So I think that that will be a deterring factor, especially for someone, for instance, like moving in from outside the city who's not used to the trains making noise all day and night, especially in New York City where they're running 24 hours. The specific degree of impact, I'm not sure about, but I do think that it'll play a role in the immediate areas.
Thank you, Nitsia, sorry. I think we have Professor Peters want to chime in.
I just want to say thank you all, everybody, all the speakers. It's really great to see you all visiting us at CSI. I really appreciate you all coming out. Gianna and I get together on a regular basis at GC in the environmental science program. But, you know, I looked at all this and I said, it sounds like we can't invest in communities. Is that what we're getting out of this? Because if we invest in these communities, the next thing you know, it gentrifies and everybody who's moderate and middle income is driven out. Is that sounds like it's an unfortunate reality.
I hope that nobody comes away with that impression. So we're saying we need to improve communities, obviously. Some communities in New York need a lot of help environmentally and health-wise, but we have to be judicious in how we do it. And we can't make these improvements in lower income communities that aren't going to benefit the lower income people. So it's a matter of being smart about how we do development. And I know Jin, being from the New York City Economic Development Corporation, and I know her husband is an urban planner. So I hope everybody's on the same page with this. And I think everybody is. It's tough to do it because it requires governmental initiative, governmental policy setting and implementation. And it's not something that the communities can do on their own. The communities can do a lot, but they can't set policy and make laws. So this is what it's going to take. And I think up until now, government, even well-meaning people, have kind of, turned a blind eye to what development is really doing. I mean, I live in Washington Heights, and there's a lot going on up here and in Inwood. People freaking out about zoning changes and all these new high rises going up and all kinds of stuff happening. And it's happening in communities all over the city, and nobody seems to be really addressing the fact that we can't keep going on like this. But
we have tremendous trouble. I specialize in transportation policy, as you know, and one of the real challenges is that many of the moderate income neighborhoods are being driven away from transit, and we have a transit system that doesn't serve the city universally. And, where do we make our next investment? And I'll just point you to our most recent big expansion, which was the Second Avenue subway. Wasn't for moderate income households.
Yeah.
And that was a huge choice of the spending. And again, I'm going to have to look at that and say, I think that you can do better. But it's a real challenge. I just, listening to your presentations, I got more challenged, right?
Yeah, I mean, it is very discouraging. It's a conundrum. It's hard to know how do we dig ourselves out of this, where people aren't afraid to invest in neighborhoods. That's not what we want, but we just want the investment to be not just benefiting the wealthy and the more affluent people.
Hmm.
But
So
then there's less profit in that. So, what fun is that, right?
So not speaking on behalf of the New York City Economic Development Corporation, just having kind of survived through the last 20 years in New York City as a planner coming from the economic development perspective. I think everything we do is true, Professor Peters, that anything we touch somehow it affects that way. But I think we are learning to be better about thinking about being balanced, about don't think that everything is monolithic. If this worked here, it will work there. We really need to think of a policy as an overall policy. But when you execute and do a development, true development, whether it's in even a big project like the Second Avenue, the train stops, and it's really about you really now have to really look at the local where you're touching, right? And I guess the other thing about all of this is all of us who do a lot of engagement, maybe a question to all of you might be, what are some, perhaps we should think about what is the best way to engage folks? Because if they don't know it's coming and they can't defend themselves, the residents, it's just a bit hard. So I think giving them knowledge is really important just so they can stand where they live. Sorry. I'm stepping off my soapbox, going back to the moderator role and going back to some fantastic questions. But if anyone wants to talk about the balanced approach, please do.
I just want to tell everybody I'm on a panel at the National Academy of Sciences on these issues, which is how is gentrification impact social justice? And we're just starting to wrestle with it, and it's a national problem. And the issues that are ahead of us are quite daunting. And we'll have an update in a couple of years when the project's over, but it's a massive problem across the country.
Can I just say that I think you should release little reports and updates periodically, because in 2 years, whatever you said like 2 years ago is now old. Again, stepping off my soapbox, going back to questions. Please have quarterly updates. So sorry. Yes, there are lots of questions. Nora, you may have to help me, because all of a sudden there's a lot of questions showing up and I lost track and not doing a very good job. Sorry, folks. So let me just go back to my original list and then go back to the piece. Here's a good one. A very open question. To Rose, I think, do you think the climate change can be fixed by people?
By individual people? No.
People, I think all of us. I hope that's what Miriam means.
I think there's so many contributing factors that it's almost not a fair question. I wish that we weren't in this weird resilience paradigm right now when it comes to building. Where it's like, well, if we put a private rooftop garden on this building, we're going to slow climate change. Whereas the real sustainable thing to do is fortify the things we already have. I don't really know how to answer that question.
Maybe we start with do your part every day.
I mean, so many of us don't even have enough money to contribute as much to climate change as a private jet. If I use a straw every single day, it's nothing compared to what's going on. I can't even afford to buy enough stuff to pollute as much as like one ultra wealthy person,
Now that's a chart I like to see. I'm so sorry. There's lots of fantastic questions. Please hang in there with me, audience. So here's maybe an easier question for our data science folks here. To all speakers, what was the most complicated data to get? Okay, sometimes that's the hardest question. And all of y'all are mute.
Well, I was going to say, like most of my projects, I try very hard to work with publicly available data for the reason that it can be really frustrating and arduous to try to work with data that's, you have to get any kind of special permission or, FOIA requests or anything like that. I mean, in general, health data at a very fine resolution is probably the hardest thing to get. Sometimes things from public agencies like DEP, they're not very forthcoming, and you have to actually put in a FOIL request. So it really depends on the project. All of this demographic stuff is great because most of it you can do either with ACS or the census. And of course, the Department of City Planning has a fantastic demographic unit and they make all their stuff available. But I would say generally it's the health data and environmental data. And environmental data is tough, not only because sometimes agencies don't want to give it out, but also it's just not available. Nobody has it, so environmental data is tough to get. Air quality data that's really meaningful, water quality data sometimes. So, I mean, I think, Rose and Yanitza probably have something to say as well.
So I know that the data that was hard to find ended up being data that wasn't included. For instance, I know at some point we were trying to find specific buildings that were newly constructed, like their footprints, but there was no way to get like a layer of all of them, really. Like we could have some, but we could never have them all. So we ended up ultimately excluding them. We were also looking for things like increases in rent, but that's not something that we would have easily accessible either. Like there's no chance that we would end up with rent prices from 2010 and then 2019 for all buildings. So that was also something that we weren't able to include. There are other indices in our very long literature review and a lot of other studies that we read where people were able to get that data for smaller cities like San Francisco, but that's not something that's available in New York. So yeah, essentially all the stuff that wasn't included is stuff that I wasn't able to get, unfortunately. But we would like to include those. If there's a way for us to get our hands on that data, that would be great.
I'm just going to extend this data question. I think, so sorry, who asked this question? Katie asked the question, none of the presentation include crime of anything related to broken windows. Was that intentional? What about factors related to stop question, stop and frisk question? But before that, I think, Rose, did you want to say a thing or two about the tough, hard to get data, or you guys want to jump into this question to include crime or not to include crime?
I agree with both sentiments, and I just think you can never get the data refined enough. The data's not block level, even census tract. Maybe there's one area that has no tree coverage within a big block that says there's no heat vulnerability here. It doesn't find it. It's really hard to get refined data that accurately depicts everybody's lived experience. We live within a color block, but like it's not very refined, if that makes sense.
I tend to my own personal experience about data sometimes is people you use the data other people collected for different purpose. They didn't always quite collect it for you. So having tried to kind of take it apart and put it back in has always been a challenge. So kudos to all of you for the amazing way you have to reassemble Legoing the data. But would you like guys to address the question on crime data that may or may not have made it into your studies?
Could you just repeat the question? I don't think I heard the first bit.
Absolutely. So sorry. I am trying to be responsive. Hang on one second. But in the meantime, and when I go back to that question, I just want to also say Viviana wants to thank Juliana and Yanita for the great presentation, for your expert contribution to the Bronx Council on the Arts and Gentrification Risk Project. And she asked the question, would adding a layer of data on rezoning of new building projects help corroborate findings in the gentrification risk story map project? If you want to answer that question, in the meantime, I'm going to find the other original, the crime question, crime data question.
Yeah, Nitsa, you want to talk about that or?
Yeah, I'll just answer briefly. Thank you, Viviana, for the idea for the project to begin with. It's been a pleasure working with you. I would say yes. So having some rezoning data would be great. I think that we did try looking for that at some point, but we had incomplete data, or the data that we did have said that that's what it was, but it was actually something else. So there were issues getting that data. So if we could get that, that would be great to include in the index.
And we also just recently saw something that the Department of City Planning put out, which was new residential construction, I think, throughout the city, but we would obviously just look at the Bronx. That might be something worthwhile, even though those are buildings now, I believe, that are already in existence, not necessarily rezonings. And let me just say, rezonings are not always that indicative of what's going to happen. It just creates a possibility for something to happen. And there have been areas of the city that have been rezoned for decades and nothing great or nothing different ever really occurred there. So that might be less of value than actually looking where people are building new residential buildings.
Building data is always tough.
Mm-hmm.
So Katie, did not forget you. Let's go back to the Katie's question. None of the presentations included crime of anything related to the broken windows. What was that intentional? What about factors related to stop and frisk? I think that's what Katie, you meant. I think if I am incorrect, please put in the chat. Oh, is that you? Okay. I hope I got that question right. Anyone?
Well, so yeah, I think crime could have an influence on where more affluent people are willing to move, for sure, right? And maybe it would be considered a deterrent. So like in the index that we developed for the Bronx, we could layer, not sure how we would do it exactly, but possibly some kind of arrests or some kind of violent crime data on top of the other factors that we're considering deterrents. I'm not really sure how much of a deterrent it would be. I mean, we could certainly look at it and see if it makes a difference. Because I know some of the areas in the South Bronx that are now considered hotspots of gentrification, not that long ago, you had to run from the subway to get to your apartment. You had to literally run. I used to work down there, so I know. And it wasn't that long ago, but it didn't seem to stop anybody from developing and gentrifying some of those neighborhoods. So yeah, I don't think it could hurt. I think it would be a good thing to add. I'm just not sure what metric we would use, arrests or violent crimes or robberies. It's hard to know what's going to have the most impact. I mean, that's true of any of the factors. And that's why we had an unweighted index.
To add on to that, I think that like Dr. Manti already said, once, it doesn't necessarily stop an area from being gentrified. Like there are a lot of times where once more expensive development, like if you start constructing more expensive housing, sometimes it does also increase police presence, which then reduces crime. So I think that there are a lot of interrelated factors when it comes to that. If I were to have to pick one without looking at the data, I'd probably start with violent crime, since that would probably be the biggest deterrent from people moving in out of fear of being brutally victimized in some way. But yeah, I think we'd have to look into like a big data set on crime and then start filtering out by crime types, arrests, and all that as well.
I'm so
yeah.
sorry. I may have, I think Katie, our audience question asked to unmute. So if she can perhaps reframe and reframe her question. Ishmael, can you unmute Katie Pominski, S-K-E-Y? I hope
Yep.
Katie is right.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, I'm Professor Katie Comiskey. I'm a professor at CSI in psychology, but I'm also the academic coordinator of CSI St. George, which is on the North Shore of Staten Island and mere blocks away from where Eric Garner was murdered. And my question was kind of more along the lines of a little bit about what Unita was referring to, which is that, you know, it's my theory and the theory of some of our community organizers that prior to Eric's death, there were community board meetings that happened around with business owners saying that the presence of certain like people hanging out on the street was sort of bringing down their property values and deterring business, like deterring customers from coming to the businesses. And so in the weeks leading up to the deadly encounter, there was an increased like police harassment of people just hanging out on the street. And one of the things that had happened was there was right before the confrontation happened, there was like a bunch of kids fighting, and Eric actually thought that the cops were there to talk to him because he broke up the fight peacefully and the kids kind of went in their opposite directions. So Eric thought that the cops were coming to talk to him about what happened because he was kind of seen as like, like an elder on the street. And then they confronted him about selling loose cigarettes. And so my question was like, could there be a way in which just the increase of police presence or police harassment around stop, question, and frisk, which it's, known as like stop and frisk, but the official definition is like the official things in cop language is like stop, question, and frisk. So like increased rates of that, could that be like signs of encouraging gentrification? Because there just seems to be like increased harassment of people, especially poor people of color on the streets in neighborhoods where there's like encouraging gentrification. So again, like I know that there has been a release of every stop because of the civil rights cases that had been brought about by by important advocates in our city. But I don't know if it's been digitized in any way. I think there might have been a couple groups doing that, but it might be interesting to see if there's that data out there to just kind of add to the mix. But the crime data, I think, is a little tricky and can be quite controversial. So thank you for your time, and thanks for this presentation.
Yeah, I think you made a very good point. There's no doubt that in neighborhoods that are seen to be gentrifying or that are already more affluent, there's no doubt there's a more strict police presence. So yeah, so I agree with you that this is something that, I don't know how we would look into it. I don't know if that data is available, the stop and frisk locations. It's hard to get crime data in any kind of way that's meaningful for spatial analysis. We're trying to do that up at Lehman. There's a Institute of Health Equity, and there's a researcher there that is focusing on violent crime. And so we've been stalking the police department website and trying to figure out how to get the data off of it in any kind of a meaningful way. And it's not that easy. I also want to say I just got a private message from Dave Bullock, who is one of my former students, and he says he's having technical difficulties and can't send a message in the chat, so he's messaging me directly. He wanted me to mention that he was a GIS intern at the Department of Health, working on mapping rat inspections. Community gardens are just like parks and a home for rats and wildlife of all types. So whoever was asking the rat question, there's the answer from one of the experts.
People feel that way about bioswales too. People are upset about burrowing rats in new, larger, deeper tree beds that accompany bioswales. But also all construction in New York City disrupts rat nests that are like underground. So pretty much anything that is construction increases rat presence. Obviously, a community garden is viewed more like a home for rats, but all construction increases rat activity, I think, overall.
So on the rat question, Juliana, I think Moose is on. He's willing to answer the question. If you want to recap the question for him,
Okay.
Before we go, I'm sorry, Juliana, before we go there, I think the same question going back on the crime question, I think Maria Isabel Roldos. Please forgive me for botching anyone's name. I just want to comment that, so she made the comment in her research, we ask communities questions about trust and positive experience with the police as a better predictor. Just want to kind of wrap that one part up. So sorry. And going back to the rat question, Juliana.
Okay, so Mustafa, hopefully you're with us now. So the question was about community gardens increasing the rat population, or maybe, I'm not sure if they would increase the rat population, but maybe the visibility of the rat population. And I was wondering if you, as a representative of the health department, would have any further insights into that.
Hey, can everyone hear me? Hopefully. Sorry,
Yes.
I was away from my PC for a bit. So that's an interesting question. I have not heard community gardens being associated with higher rat populations that are to an extent that you could see it. But that is something that I could look into and potentially follow up on. I actually don't work with that directly. My work is more with vaccines, which I think you guys all know is a hot topic these days. In terms of public health outreach and whatnot. But I personally, like, we have a rat portal, you know, and that data is available to the public to use. And I am not really aware. Who asked that question? Did they have personal experience with that? Because they could reach out to me and maybe an email chain with DOHMH can start where we could find out more information. So that could be something that could be done. But in terms of actual information on increase within community gardens, I haven't seen that. I wouldn't be surprised because of, you know, it is a community garden. It's natural. There's dirt. There's a lot of, if people are composting there and whatnot, there are places where, you know, rats could go. But I personally have not seen that information or seen like reports of that myself.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for answering that. I know there is a whole unit that deals with that at Department of Health. And I remember many years ago, Gretchen Culp made a beautiful hexbin map of rat complaints, I think it was, not rats in terms of population, but just the 311 complaints about rats. And it was a very nice map, and it might still be kicking around somewhere on the Department of Health portal. I don't know.
So folks, I have two more questions, which that's pretty good. It will take us to 8 o'clock time. The first question, I think it is going to go back to Unity about, the question is, are there any blue belts in the Bronx? And if so, has this helped?
I'm honestly not sure. It's not something that I did look at for the analysis. I don't know if Dr. Manzi has any insight on that.
I do not believe there are any blue belts. I think it's mainly Staten Island, because Staten Island was sort of underserved in water infrastructure for many years in terms of especially, what am I trying to say? Stormwater runoff and things like that. So it was natural to do in Staten Island because they didn't really have a system. So to make a, a blue belt, which is basically blue infrastructure, seemed, a good idea there. But in the other boroughs and in the Bronx, everything is pretty much underground. And I don't think there's much opportunity in the Bronx. I suppose in some of the parks, but other than that, there wouldn't be any, blue belt type stormwater system.
Right before Hurricane Sandy, Superstorm Sandy, they did do wetland restoration around the Bronx, New York Botanical Garden and Lehman College, as part of the blue belt overall. Like that's how they were advertising it. But it's not, I feel like the blue belt is not just a straight line. It's like a whole group of cooperative infrastructure. So that's the only thing I know about going on in the Bronx in terms of blue belt.
Yeah, and I'm not sure even if there was how that would factor into gentrification really. I mean, in Staten Island, it might, because those areas are very attractive. But we already count the parks as an encouraging factor. So I don't think that even if there were blue belt things happening around the parks, it would really add that much in terms of influencing gentrification.
I think I have one final question, and I think this is about the gardens, spaces. About city abandoned lots and spaces, has any economic development organizations ever tried to collaborate with the city to use these spaces as garden spaces or anything purposeful for the neighborhood until they find a purpose for it?
I don't know, Jen, that sounds like it's for you.
I know, I have to go to my press people before I can. Or certainly, the Economic Development Corporation and other agencies certainly tried our very best to have, again, balance about for business and residential uses. And I am sorry, sound like a commercial for some of the EDCs of the world, but we are certainly trying very hard to make that balance.
I know up in the Bronx, there's a Bronx Economic Development arm of, I'm not sure if it's part of city. Yeah. And years ago, I worked with them and made a map of all the vacant lots, and they were gonna start using it to get investment in communities. But unfortunately, what often happens is the first lot that anybody's interested in is where the community gardens already are. Not the vacant lots that nobody's doing anything, that have the old mattresses and stuff in it, but the ones that already are nice and beautiful and people have fruit trees and, decades of work. So my idea was that, well, let's look at what's available that hasn't been used by the community to create something beautiful, and let them look at those areas for development. But I don't know, I never followed it. This was years ago. So I assume that anybody that's in development is smart enough to realize that all of these city-owned lots are available, and the ones that aren't being used for community gardens or other community purposes, basically could be developed. One of the issues is very often they're small lots, they're 25 feet wide by 100 feet deep. And it's really not, as I said before, it's really not profitable to develop them. So unless you have kind of many adjoining vacant lots, people aren't going to be that interested.
One thing that I think is hard about these questions and the research and talking about the research is when you're talking about a gentrifier, quote unquote, some people are talking about developers and some people are talking about people who move into an apartment because they need a place to live, who happen to be like young, wealthy, and white. And when we say like, where is more attractive to gentrify, it's like, is it attractive to developers or attractive to residents? And developers develop in a way that is attractive to residents. So with the green infrastructure, which is very different from just community garden, like stormwater green infrastructure, I should probably be more specific, is those are built into the development plans. So when you're looking at Vision 2020 and other long-term development plans, there's like, we're gonna build residential buildings and make sure there's bioswales and a green roof on the building and a bioswale in front of the building. And it's made that way to attract residents. And I think all of us, if you rent a home, I don't really know anything about home ownership. I'm not going to pretend I do, but you just try to have the most balanced situation of what you can afford and the best thing you can get on your budget. So obviously people are going to be the buildings are developed to be attractive. And I feel like the conversation, there's like a slippery slope of talking about people who want to move into a nice building and not developers who intentionally change neighborhood dynamics. And that's the hard thing about like the crime rate question is like the people who are policed the most are the same people that are the most vulnerable populations or reside in the most vulnerable area in these indexes, if that makes sense. So it's a tricky situation when answering the questions if you're talking about individual people moving into homes or the actual gentrifiers, which is the developers and like the city that grants land to the developers.
Yeah, I think that's a really important distinction to make. And you know, where the blame actually lies is not with the individuals that move into a place, because everybody in the city is just looking for the best place to live that they can afford, right? And I don't think people should be castigated for that. But it's the whole development culture that's really the issue. And clearly most developers are not interested in developing things that aren't going to maximize profit, just in the same way that city planning, city planning as a profession, not as a department in the city government. City planning always elevates the highest and best use for zoning, right? The highest and best use almost always excludes the most vulnerable people, or I should say it excludes benefiting the most vulnerable people in favor of things for, you know, the highest and best use is going to get the highest and best profit. On that note, on that cheerful note, there's no hope.
No, I'm sure I'm hoping there is hope because we are having this conversation. For the next 6 minutes, I was wondering if each one of you want to give us some hope before we sign off and turn this over to Nora.
I guess for a slight glimmer of hope, I think that there has been an increase in community organizing lately for a lot of different reasons, including racial justice. And I think that part of racial justice are other things like environmental justice, socio-economic justice, and there's a growing awareness about all of these issues, including gentrification. And the continuing building of awareness is one thing that can help, and that's something that's been happening a lot, especially with people being stuck at home, not having much else to do. I know that things are starting to go back to normal for a lot of people, like socially, emotionally, mentally, educationally, with their careers. But I think that there's still that, I think a lot of seeds were planted in the previous 2 years. And I guess that we can only hope that that will continue and communities will continue to keep organizing. They'll continue to get support from those who are wealthier or hold white privilege. And yeah, we can just hope that that's enough to push things forward.
Yeah, I agree. There's been a tremendous increase in citizen participation from, even 20 years ago. What we see now, what was radical back then is now commonplace. Everybody understands, it's a whole different world. And I do think the pandemic has had some good influence on this. People are not treating everything as business as usual. I think people have had time to reflect and really don't want to go back to the old ways, what's going to happen in New York, especially, or any of the big cities, with all of our commercial buildings, all of our office towers. Who's going to populate them? Will we ever go back to living that way again? Commuting is going to be very different. People aren't going into the office every day, even if they go in a couple times a week. So I think it's a very new world, and I think we have the opportunity now to really kind of capitalize on that, and don't let's go back to the old way of doing things. Let's keep things the way they are and improve upon them, because in the end, I think our carbon footprint will be less, and it's just going to be healthier for everyone.
Rose, any last thoughts?
I mean, I was thinking along the same vein. I think people have, in New York City specifically, I think people have a new relationship with their home that they rent. I think I'm interested in the psychoanalysis of it all. I really don't understand environmental psychology. I wish I did, but a lot of people aren't just viewing their apartments as essentially hotel rooms now. And I think a lot of people move to New York thinking of their apartment as like a temporary thing. And some of us live our whole lives in apartment buildings that we rent, and could probably buy a house with all the money we've spent on rent over a lifetime. It'd be great, right? But I think a lot more people are more cognizant of like renter landlord issues. And a lot of those people are maybe more able to speak up. Like people who have voices that are more heard are maybe having more interesting relationship to home concepts.
Well, what you just said, but I wonder if there could be a policy to rent to own.
That would be wonderful.
I mean, a lot of people are interested in removing the idea that you can be an absent landlord. I mean, in the 90s and the 80s and all, before that, your landlord was a person who owned a building, and now it's a huge company. Like my building's owned by an LLC, whereas when I was young, my building was owned by like Hugo, who owned the building. And I think the owners don't have the same relationship with the building. Rents have like quadrupled in the last 20 or 30 years, which is a very extreme thing. And people's incomes go up, 10% in 30 years? So rent burden is becoming tremendous. Yeah, I think there are people who are working for those more protective policies.
So we not only to be ownership, we have to look at the rent model as well.
I think so.
Sorry, is that one last comment?
I just said I think so.
Okay. Well, amazing. Thank you, ladies. And I really had my own question. I think I'm gonna have to privately email you guys soon. And Rose, I hope you will give quarterly or twice a year update and updates of your research, I think is going to be ongoing challenge. And the gentrification studies that Juliana and Yanitza is doing, please also, you should have a blog, right? So we can all follow. And I thank the College of Staten Island for this evening, and also Lehman College. Go CUNY. Now back to Nora.
Thank you so much, everyone. What a wonderful evening. I have just a couple of announcements that I would like to make. Those students who are interested in receiving CLUE credit tonight, I will send the sheet to the CLUE office so they will. I can verify that you attended the meeting. I also have a message from our CSI's very own GIS professor, Nerv McCaspach. He just wanted to let you know, if you're interested in learning GIS as an undergrad at CSI, there's a Geography 212 class, Introduction to GIS, which is going to be offered online in the spring semester. Another announcement, like a shout out to Esri. We all use the software. We love the software, our GIS, and they're giving away 5 one-year licenses. So I will run a number generator on the attendees based on the order they registered, and we're going to notify the winners via email and send the link to 1-year ArcGIS licenses. But most of all, I would like to thank you, all of you who attended CSI and Lehman's 2 days of GIS celebration. Thank you for our speakers for sharing all the research that you're working on. I would like to thank everyone who helped organize this event and ensuring that it runs smoothly. You know, there's a lot of people in the background working on it. And I would like to thank our administration for their support, President Fritz, Rob Wallace, our VP for Economic Development and Continuing Studies and Government Relations, Jasmine Cardona, our Executive Director. But most of all, Ishmael Hassan, we couldn't do it without him. Every year he helps out and he does so many things, the marketing and the graphic design, and I can just go on. And I have one more big announcement. This is very important. Please write down the date, okay? GIS Day 2022, you need to know the date, right? So it's November 16th next year. So we hope to see you back here. Hopefully hosting another 2-day event, and we would love to see all of you. And thank you so much, and have a good night.
Thank you, Nora.
Thank you so much. Have a good night, everyone.
Bye.